This lecture is going to be the historical books part 1, the Deuteronomistic history. The books included are Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, not the book of Ruth. So if you're doing the Christian Bible, it's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, King. Jews call these the former prophets. The latter prophets are the ones that we think of as normally as prophets. But these, according to Jewish tradition, they were written by prophets, and so they're called the former prophets. The time period covered from about 1250 to 575, from the death of Moses to inside the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem was destroyed in 587. Varied sources, ancient poetry, for instance, the Song of Deborah, which some think that's archaizing, that it's just pretending to be old, but the scholars that I find most convincing say it is an ancient dialect of Hebrew. And having tried to read it, I'm convinced. It's not like the easy prose that I read. There are legends and sagas, stories of Gideon and Samson, Elisha and Elisha cycles. Think of Davy Crockett, our American hero. When I was 9 years old, I learned, born on the mountaintop in Tennessee, green estate in the land of the free, raised in the woods so he knew every tree, and killed him a bar when he was only 3. Davy Crockett. Okay, so there you go. And if you put these to music, even 9-year-olds can remember them when they're 67. Okay, so these were the kind of part of the sources. But then also there were royal archives. These are the most historically reliable materials, but a lot of times the editor isn't even interested in them. He'll say, and the rest of all that this king did, aren't they written in the archives of the kings of Israel? Or isn't this written in the archives of the kings of Judah? And we'd give our right arm, to have those archives, but that wasn't his goal, to reproduce the archives. The approximate date, the sources, oral and written, were arranged in their present form about 550 BC, that is, during the exile. The perspective is the nation of Israel as a whole came out of Egypt and was led by the Lord to the promised land, the land promised in the prequel, Genesis, to the patriarchs. A historical note, the formation of Israel as a nation was a much more complex process, and this is a subject for a more advanced class. We have a cycle which repeats over and over in these books, from Joshua through Kings. The Lord blesses His people with peace and prosperity. 2, Israel, once prosperous, begins to worship false gods. 3, the Lord punishes Israel by allowing their enemies to triumph over them. 4, Israel cries out to the Lord, who sends leaders, judges, prophets, kings. 5, through a Savior, a judge or a king, the Lord blesses Israel with peace and prosperity, and then the cycle repeats over and over and over again, all the way up until the exile, when the Lord gets finally fed up and punishes the people with exile. So the exile is not proof that Marduk, the god of Babylon, is more powerful than the Lord, the God of Israel. It is Yahweh Himself who is punishing His people. Joshua is the successor to Moses in the New Testament. Jesus is named after him. Our English name Jesus comes from the Greek Jesus, which is what Joshua is called in the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament in Greek, the 6th book of the Bible is the book of Jesus. And as the historical Jesus scholar John Meyer said, what did the little kids say when they came over to Joe and Mary's house? Can Josh come out and play? His name in Hebrew was Joshua. There are difficult passages. The Lord instructs Joshua to wipe out every living being in the Canaanite cities, men, women, children, animals. Quote, Joshua conquered the entire land, the mountain regions, the Negev, the Shephelah, and the mountain slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivors, but put under the band every living being, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Some people erroneously believe that the Quran is more violent than either the Old Testament or the New Testament. Every religion has its dark side, texts that can be misinterpreted to justify violence and hatred. Now, some people find consolation in the idea that it's not actually what happened, but it's what they should have done. That is, the Deuteronomic historian is an author writing during the exile in Babylon, where Israel is being punished for worshiping false gods. The Deuteronomistic historian is convinced this would not have happened if Israel had totally wiped out all of the pagans to start with. He is absolutely convinced that that is what the Lord wanted Joshua to do. He therefore portrays the Israelite conquest in what he considers to be an idealized version. This is what we should have done. Judges gives a more realistic picture. The book of Joshua portrays a totally victorious military campaign which covers the whole country and slaughters everybody. Joshua 10 reports the defeat of the king of Jerusalem. But the Jebusites still ruled in that city in David's time a couple centuries later. The book of Judges makes clear that, in fact, much of the land was not conquered. They're called judges, but the judges did not hear law cases. They were more like generals. They were not professional soldiers. They were charismatic leaders whom the Lord raised up at a time of danger when their enemies. They would rally around this chieftain. They would defeat the enemy, and then he would go back to farming. If you've studied classics like the original Roman general Cincinnatus, who defeated enemies that were besieging Rome, and then he goes back to his farm. He doesn't become emperor or king. So this was the ideal in ancient Israel. We have chronological oversimplification. Judges portrays these leaders as if they ruled all Israel successively. First, this judge ruled all Israel, then that judge ruled all Israel. Well, if you add up all the years, it comes to too much time. Scholars are convinced of several things. First of all Israel did not yet exist historically as a unified people. And so the judges ruled over one tribe or perhaps a coalition of several tribes that bounded together for an emergency, and different judges were ruling in different areas simultaneously. 1 and 2 Samuel. From Samuel to the kingship of David. The story of the birth of Samuel has inspired Luke's accounts of the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus. Luke has modeled Mary's Magnificat on the Old Testament Song of Hannah in chapter 2 of the first book of Samuel. Samuel was the last of the judges, the last of these charismatic leaders. He anoints the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. The Deuteronomistic historian draws on two sources, one pro-monarchical, one anti-monarchical. According to the anti-monarchical source, it was a sin to ask for a human king. He will be an oppressive tyrant. Israel, we're egalitarian. There is no king but Yahweh. According to the pro-monarchical source, it is God's will that Israel have a king who will save them from the enemies around them. And politically, their enemies were very much more organized than they were, and it was probably the only way to survive. Two traditions of how Saul meets David. In the first, David becomes Saul's minstrel who drives away an evil spirit. The second tradition is the well-known story of David and Goliath. The original author of this tradition seemed not to know the previous story of David as minstrel, for As Saul watched David go out to meet the Philistine, he asked his general Abner, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "On your life, O king, I have no idea." So you would never think that David had been playing the harp for poor Saul for a year or more. According to another tradition, it was one of David's mighty men who killed Goliath. In 2 Samuel we read, "There was another battle with the Philistines in Gob, and Elhanan, son of Jair from Bethlehem, killed Goliath of Gath, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam." His name is Goliath. He's from the same place, and his spear is like a weaver's beam, just like the one that David is given credit for. So, what kind of truth? We're not dealing with history here. These narratives are more like the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. They teach an inspired truth, but they don't teach accurate history any more than Genesis 1 to 2 teaches accurate science. One of the questions we have to ask when we read Scripture is, what kind of truth are we learning in this passage? Sometimes we say, well, if it's not scientifically true, it's not true. If it's not historically true, it's not true. That's our modern prejudices, that we think that science and history are the only kind of truths. The deeper truths of life are beyond science, I'm convinced. Of course, my prejudice as a believer is coming through here. The rise of David. He begins as a kind of thug running a protection racket. When he flees from Saul, debtors and other thugs join his gang. My favorite story is the story of Nabal. And Nabal is shearing his sheep, and David sends men and says, "Now, you're shearing your sheep, and me and the boys, we've been up in the mountains and we've been watching them. And none of the bad guys got any of your sheep while we were on guard. It would be a shame if anything happened to them." So it's a protection racket. "So what are you going to give us?" And Nabal says, "Get lost." So when David hears this, he straps on his sword and he says, "I'll be damned if tomorrow morning there's left from Nabal anyone who pisses against the wall." That's the way you say a male in Hebrew when you're mad. We had to prepare the book of Samuel for our language exams, and I was studying with a Dominican sister. Don't know that word. Says it means piss. Well, they better not ask me that one. Anyway, so David and his guys are ready to go, and Abigail, Nabal's wife, comes out, and she says, he's like his name. It means fool. Nabal means fool. And so she comes up, and she's got lots of sheep and goats and everything. He goes, "Take this." And when her husband hears what she's done, he gets apoplectic and dies of a stroke. And so Abigail becomes, I believe, David's first wife, or one of his early wives. So this was David's beginning. He would have classified as a terrorist or a thug. Eventually, after Saul's death, he becomes king over Judah only, reigning in Hebron for about 7 years. During this time, there's a struggle with the followers of Saul. Eventually, David becomes king over all Israel. He captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital city. Then we have the sin of David. The most famous is his adultery with Bathsheba. And there are different takes on this story. Did David take advantage of this innocent woman? Or did she have absolutely no idea that the king might peek while she was taking a bath on her roof, which was below his palace? King David had several sons by wives who were older than Solomon, but it was Bathsheba's son Solomon who succeeded David on the throne. So is this a woman who knew what she wanted from day one? 1 Kings tells how Bathsheba and Nathan plotted to make Solomon king over the head of Adoniah and older brothers. Solomon's building projects. The Jerusalem temple received a mixed reception. The temple was built by Hiram, the king of Tyre. It was archaeologically indistinguishable from pagan Canaanite temples. Many in the northern tribes preferred the old-time religion before there was a temple. Solomon's building projects, which benefited mainly his own tribe of Judah, required heavy taxation and corvée, which is the French word for levied labor. You have to work for a month or two out of the year for the king, come to Jerusalem, help him build his temple. They said, well, we used to build for the Egyptians, now we're slaves to the king. It was not well received. So we get the divided kingdom. Jeroboam becomes king of the 10 northern tribes. Rehoboam, king of Judah and Benjamin. He's Solomon's son. The destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians occurs in 721 BC. The 10 northern tribes vanish from history. The Deuteronomistic historians give all of the northern kings a negative rating. He sinned as bad as Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Most historians think that Omri, in all his glory, from archaeological evidence, was much more magnificent than David or even Solomon, but the Deuteronomistic historian gives him 12 verses because he permitted the worship of other gods. The destruction of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians occurred in 587 BC. The Deuteronomistic historians give bad ratings to all of the kings but 2, Hezekiah and Josiah, who were the only 2 who wanted to worship the Lord alone. All the others allowed the worship of other gods. The final paragraph of the Deuteronomistic historian: in the 37th year of exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, on the 27th day of the 12th month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the inaugural year of his own reign, raised up Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne higher than that of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiakim took off his prison garb. He ate regularly in the king's presence as long as he lived, and for his allowance the king granted him a regular allowance in fixed daily amounts for as long as he lived. End of the story. So the story ends with Israel still enslaved in exile, but their king is being treated kindly.